8th. It's about 3:30, 3:40 in the afternoon, and I'm sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. I'm going to be discussing today, this won't be a really long live stream, but I'm going to be discussing today a tweet that I put up yesterday regarding the hyper-individualism and worldview that is a part of the Western Christianity, and I'm going to talk about that mixed with its inability to cope or deal with systemic sin. So I was tweeting about that yesterday. It's garnered a lot of response and discussion online, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about it over my second cup of coffee. But before I begin, as I always do, let me start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from my home in Washington, D.C., and these are the lands of the Piscataway. And it's the Piscataway who were here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they're still here. So I want to acknowledge and honor the Piscataway. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands, and I want to state how humbled I am publicly to be living on these lands today. So I have my Piscataway relatives. Yesterday afternoon, I was just on my social media, and I noticed a few people commenting and talking about the church and social justice. And of course, there's two sides to the debate, and there's one group of people that says we need to deal with social justice, and another side that says, well, the church should not be involved in political things such as social justice, and they leave it alone. And so I put out a tweet, and I said, if your church is hesitant to call our work for social justice, that's probably because it's grown comfortable benefiting from social injustice. And that tweet got a fairly good response. There was a lot of people kind of interacting with it, and so I decided to do another tweet, and this one was about an hour or 2 hours later, and I tweeted out, Western Christianity preaches a hyper-individualistic salvation, so it doesn't have to repent of its systemic sin. And I posted that onto my Twitter account, and just a few seconds after I posted it, it started getting liked and retweeted and commented on. And so I put it up onto my Facebook and my Instagram. And in the last 24 hours, it has really generated a lot of dialogue and a lot of discussion, especially on Twitter. I think it's got about 140,000 impressions so far. I think over 6,000 interactions. And there's a lot of really good comments out there. I was just looking through them a little bit before I got online here, and I'll just share a few of them with you. A lot of people just retweeted it and said things like, yes, all of this, this 1,000 times this, this is so true. Someone else said, until now, I've never thought about the implications of rugged American individualism on possibly changing how the gospel is taught and received in the Western world. This makes a whole lot of sense all of a sudden, though. Someone else commented and said, it's midnight. This was last night, and my husband is asleep, but man, do I want to run around and holler. Another person said, this is so beautifully articulated. Someone else said, this is lit. Another person said, I'm meditating on this idea for the next week. And this is, of course, Holy Week, as today is Palm Sunday. Someone else said, this is one of the most succinct ways of wording one of the most dangerous problems of U.S. Christian doctrine. Even individual sin doesn't occur in a vacuum, nor are its victims perfectly isolated. Someone else retweeted it and said, oop, there it is. Someone else said, tweet or preach. Someone else said, this is the tweet of the day. And those are just a few of the comments and a few of the things that people said about this tweet. And as I kind of watched it grow and the dialogue generate around it both last night and then again this morning and throughout the afternoon, I realized this tweet really touched a nerve. And there were a lot of comments of people who said how this was a very succinct way of describing the problem, and it kind of almost a whole sermon in a single tweet in a few hundred characters. And so I want to just share a little bit about some of what's behind this tweet for me, why I've been thinking about this topic, and some of the implications I see of this. So what I tweeted yesterday was not a new thought. And if you followed me, or if you've read my book, Unsettling Truths, or if you followed the things I teach on, you'll see I talk a lot about the hyper-individualism of Western culture and of the American church. And I try to talk about and highlight some of the ways that this really does not give people space, especially Western Christians, to deal with systemic sin. I've made the comparison. I made the observation before that, right? You can walk into a Western church and you can say, hey, I struggle with this sin. I struggle with, I've committed adultery in my marriage, or I've murdered somebody, or I've done some harm. I've stolen this thing. And you can confess some type of individual sin. And the church will greet you, and they'll welcome you, and they'll say, you can be saved from your sin, and there's this guy Jesus, and he can help you out, and it will work very hard. Obviously, there will be legal things that need to be dealt with, but they will offer you a personal salvation to deal with your individual sin. But if you go to the church, and almost any person of color has had this experience, where you go into a church, into a body of believers, and you want to deal not with an individual sin, but with systemic sin, with institutionalized racism or white supremacy, with institutionalized sexism or other systemic sins. And frequently, when you bring these types of sins to the church doesn't know what to do with it. I don't know how many times people have offered to wash my feet, right? Or I know they want to, or even they've come up and they want to confess their sin to me and apologize to me there on the spot. And it's like that, you're not understanding the problem. This is a systemic sin. This is an institutionalized sin. This is a corporate sin. And if you've read the book I co-authored with Sing-Chan Ra, in chapters 1 through 4, we deal with both the narrative of white supremacy and how that's so difficult and challenging to change. And we also deal with how the church got from the teachings of Jesus to a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. And point out very clearly how, going back to the writings of Eusebius in the early 4th century, in his book Ecclesiastical History, how as he's recording this history of the church, and he's introducing, in an effort to stop the persecution of the church, he introduces the heresy of Christian empire and props up Constantine as a God-ordained emperor. And because Christ was opposed to Christian empire, the conclusion of his book literally writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history. And it talks about the salvation that came to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. And make the point that, as I've made the point in the book and in my speeches, where if you want to create the heresy of Christian empire, your biggest challenge is Christ. Because if you read his teachings and look at his life, he was adamantly, absolutely opposed to establishing some sort of Christian imperial empire. That was not his plan or agenda whatsoever. And so if you want to establish that, as Eusebius did, you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history, which is what they did. And so what that leaves is, it leaves this institution, this church, this body, corporate group of believers that now has no way to deal with its own shortcomings, because it's written Christ out of ecclesiastical history. And I argue, we make the argument in the book, that if the Messiah figure in that 4th century version of Christendom was Constantine, the Messiah figure in our context, in Americans' version of Christendom, is Abraham Lincoln. And even though he was assassinated, he was shot on Good Friday, his blood doesn't do squat for you. And so what this leaves the church is, when it has to deal with a corporate sin, a systemic sin, an institutional sin, the church has no sandbox, no theological space to deal with that, because it's written Christ out of its corporate theological history. And so all it's left with is this hyper-individualism. So yes, this guy Jesus can forgive you of your personal sins, but he's impotent to deal with your corporate, systemic, institutional sins. And so the church literally has no space to deal with systemic, corporate, institutional sin. Which is why, if you go into a church and you want to deal with these sorts of sins, aside from washing your feet the church has no clue what to do with you. Also, this is because the church doesn't want to give up the fruits, right? Because the church has been in bed with empire for hundreds of years. It's gained a lot of fruit from the systemic, institutionalized corporate sins or injustices that it's enacted and has used to enrich itself and establish itself and everything else. And so now to repent of those things would require giving those things up. And the church has very little interest in doing that. And so the church is not interested in dealing with systemic corporate sin, and it doesn't have the theological space to deal with systemic corporate and institutionalized sin. And so this is the frustration that I was trying to articulate in that tweet yesterday. Is the church is literally impotent. It does not have its own heresy, the heresy of Christendom, of Christian empire, has left it with no place to go. And so it is not able to deal with these things. It's not able to even lead or be a part of a healthy dialogue regarding this. Now, there's obviously there will become, as even happened on my Twitter thread and my other social media where I posted this, there immediately becomes this reaction of, well, this is the liberals do this or the conservatives do this. And like, no, this is not dependent on what side of the aisle you're on, right? This is a part of Western culture. This is part of the heresy of Western Christianity. This is part of what goes into the writing of the doctrine of discovery. This is if you want to call it a bipartisan value, this is the whole of Western Christianity. It's not just the left or the right. It's not just the progressives or the liberals. We can't just point the finger at that side or this side. No, this is the whole that is wrestling with this and dealing with these things. And that's one of the things that the church needs to begin to wrestle with if it's going to make any progress in this. It was probably two and a half years ago, I was speaking at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. It's called TEDS. And I gave a speech there. And in that speech, I asked the question, whose blood covers systemic corporate sin? This came out before my book came out, but it was a lot of the same material we had written into the book. I'm going to share that link on my YouTube, to my YouTube channel, or to a YouTube channel that has that sermon in there, or that lecture I gave at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. There also is a webinar I gave just a few months ago, early in 2021, January of 2021, at the Mennonite Central Committee's webinar. And the title of this webinar was The Spiritual Costs of the Doctrine of Discovery with Mark Charles. And it's about an hour-and-a-half webinar. And I go through some of the same material we use in the TEDS presentation, but also other material that's been a part of the book and things like that. And it's just got posted online a few weeks ago, I think. And so it doesn't have a lot of views yet, maybe 500 or 600 views. But I think it's a really good presentation to kind of draw people into this dialogue and go a little bit more in depth. And then, of course, the book that we wrote, it's really chapters 1 through 4 that deal with a lot of this, although the whole book kind of goes that same way. And really addresses this throughout the whole book. I'm giving example after example, but especially chapters 1 through 4 dealing with how we get from the teachings of Jesus to the doctrine of discovery. All of these kind of deal with this question. And so this is something I want to continue engaging in, right? Even as I want to begin doing a series, and I've been making more plans, I'm getting closer to doing this, on decolonizing faith. And what does it mean to decolonize our faith, especially the Christian faith? Because it has become so embedded with empire. It has become so aligned with injustice. It has been used not only to colonize, but to enslave and commit genocide to marginalized peoples around the world. That to move it forward, we absolutely need to decolonize this faith. and begin to look at it in a whole different light and context, and with a new or different understanding of what to do with these teachings. And so this is something I'm going to be addressing more and more in my live streams these next few days. But because this tweet got so much energy online, I wanted just to jump onto a live stream this afternoon and address it for a few moments. I'm kind of watching the dialogue that's happening. I'm trying to engage with a few people as it's going by. I'm mostly just letting the conversation flow and letting people respond to it and react to it, and kind of seeing where it goes. And then in the next few days, I'll probably do another live stream to talk a little bit more about the response to that tweet and what we need to do to move it forward. Yeah, so it's on my Twitter account, which is Wireless Hogan. It's on my Facebook account, which is Mark Charles Wireless Hogan, and it's on my Instagram account, which is also Wireless Hogan. So you can interact with that tweet or with that post, any of those places. And I encourage you to share it. I encourage you to jump in and join that dialogue. There's a lot of things that the church specifically needs to address in this. And I'm glad we can have this dialogue publicly, because this isn't just about the church, right? Because this doctrine, this heresy, has become embedded into the foundations of the nation. It actually doesn't matter what faith tradition you come from. If you live here in the United States of America, or if your life in some way, either positively or negatively, has been impacted by Western colonialism, all of these things are fruits of the doctrine of discovery, which comes out of this heresy embedded into Western Christianity. And so I'm not even sharing this to be evangelical. I'm not even sharing this to try to draw people to this faith. I'm saying, no, this is what we have to deal with, because this is what the church has been preaching for hundreds, even thousands of years. And it has wrought untold damage on marginalized peoples, communities of color, indigenous peoples in the continent of Africa and Asia and the US and around the world. Unbelievable damage has been wrought because of this heresy, because of this belief. And so we absolutely need to, for the sake of even building a better society, even a pluralistic society, we have to decolonize the Christian faith and remove the way it's embedded itself, its heresies, into the foundations of societies and cultures and governments and laws around the world. And so we very much need to have, even though this is about a Christian doctrine, this is a doctrine that's become so pervasive that it's affected most of the globe. And so we have to have this conversation very, very publicly. I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I appreciate you jumping on with me this afternoon for a few moments. There's a lot going on this next week. I'm actually looking forward to engaging more online through my second cups of coffee. And good news is it's going to be fairly clear most this week in DC, so I should be able to watch the sunrise 3 or 4 mornings this next week too. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, I hope you have a great day. I hope you continue to reflect on these things along with me. I look forward to continuing to discuss them and engage them and even deconstruct them. And all of this is for the goal of walking in beauty, not only with one another, but with all of our environment, with all of the world, this natural world that we're a part of. So, I have my relatives, Hakonet, and then we learn how to walk in beauty together.